Hello everyone, my name is Fraser Waldron, and in this video I want to talk about the geopolitical situation occurring in the Middle East, specifically the US and Israeli-led assault or attack on the Iranian regime. One, I want to talk about the Iranian regime and what it is and what it is not. And then two, I want to talk about how this affects the geopolitical space globally, because I think this is a key turning point in the world order, let's say. So the reason I want to bring this up is because I keep getting a lot of comments to me personally from friends who know that I have an expertise in this context, let's say, both from a personal point of view, academically, but also from some of my work in the past. This is a topic that's close to my heart. And the second one is that when I'm looking over the landscape, it seems that the Middle East in general, and specifically Iran, is not a well-known subject to the average person, which isn't to say people are smart or intelligent or not. It's just more that there's just not a lot of context on the state of the state of play in the Middle East in general. And I want to just kind of lay that out in a super simplistic form. So the first thing I want to talk about is how Iran, the government, not the people, but the government itself, is not a legitimate state in the global world context. Okay, so in the last decades, since the revolution in '79, the Iranian regime has essentially existed in contrast to the United States. So when tyrannical governments are in power and they're not particularly popular, they need a contrasting agent in order to remain legitimate. So for example, like a more vanilla version of that is the Republicans need the Democrats and the Democrats need the Republicans. They need their opposite in order to legitimize the reason for their existence. So in the Iranian context, the government essentially, one of their pillars is that they're in contrast to the Americans or the West in general, or Israel, for example. But let's just stick with America. So in this contrast, their entire foreign policy and domestic policy is geared towards this framing of reality. So essentially what's happened over the past, let's say, 2 decades, if we narrow it down a little bit, is that the Iranians have funded and supported many conflicts in the region, including funding and supporting Hamas, including funding and supporting Hezbollah, including funding and supporting the Houthis, as well as militias in both Syria and Iraq when the Americans were involved in Iraq in a big way. So the Iranians have funded, supported, and given logistical support to all these different groups, which has destabilized the Middle East for decades, but also has attacked American military personnel directly and inflicted losses on them for a long period of time. They've also supported through material means in Afghanistan as well. So a lot of Americans and Western troops by that nature have perished at the end result of logistical support from Iran. So the Iranians are not a neutral country that just sits and does nothing. They're actively engaged in a foreign policy to destabilize the region as long as it antagonizes either Israel or more specifically the United States, which again, they need to have that antagonist. This is why the diplomatic angle almost never works. So that's regional instability. The second P, and terrorism, essentially. They're the largest state-sponsored group supporting terrorism on the planet by far. It's just not well known to the average person walking down the street in Canada or the US. The second piece is that there's regional instability created by Iran, but also global instability, which is mostly based on their attempt to get nuclear weapons, or at least leverage the idea that they're going to get them. They've made material strides to do so. And this has created regional instability because if Iran gets nuclear weapons, then Saudi and the other countries would need to also potentially get nuclear weapons. And at the global level, it's just a huge instability for the region. The second piece is that the government is illegitimate to its own people. They have suppressed and repressed the Iranian population for a very long period of time. In the revolution, the super religious fundamentalist cohort was just one of many that overthrew the Shah at the time. Fair enough. But that religious cohort, that really fundamentalist group of people, let's say in Iran, took over, and it was no longer a pluralist movement, but a very narrow-based movement. So all the pluralist groups, because Iran is a big country with many different ethnic groups and groupings, leave it at that, was no longer able to be involved in the government in the way that they probably thought they were going to be. So even in the past few months, there's been thousands, if not tens of thousands, of essentially murders or killings where the Islamic State of Iran, the theocratic leaders of Iran, greenlit essentially the murder of their own citizens at a mass level, which delegitimizes them across the globe. So they're essentially the most sanctioned country outside of North Korea, I would guess, for the world essentially condemning that activity and just the destabilization over decades and decades and decades. The last piece I would add too is that the Iranian regime in general has been resistant to all diplomatic talks to reduce their regional destabilization. And really, the only reason that the Americans and the Israelis have been able to do the strikes as they are doing right now is because, probably most likely, from the war in Ukraine with Russia, because when the Russians got bogged down in Ukraine for the last 4 years, essentially, that has limited their ability to support Iran, because there is a loose alignment between Iran, Russia, and China and they're combating or competing against the West, which would be the US, the Western liberal democracies, Japan, Australia, Europe, Canada, North America. And these two blocks are at odds with each other. It's more complex than that, but just as a high level. So when Russia invaded Ukraine, Iran supported that diplomatically with lots of drones. They provided technological support, etc. And the Russians were happy with that. But because the Russians got bogged down in Ukraine and all their materials went into that, they were not necessarily good allies. And the US and Israel and her allies have essentially picked off one Russian strategic partner at a time. And you can see that in Syria, the Russians were unable to logistically support the Assad regime. The Iranians were unable to support the regime as well, because they were just a bit weaker with all the sanctions. That regime fell. You can see that with Hamas, which was supported by Iran. That group is really, the Israelites took them out completely to an extent, and were no longer able to support. And then Hezbollah in Lebanon, it's the same thing. Iran was weakened, Russia was weakened, and support for that group was diminished. And Israel essentially took that group out as well. And then the Houthis were placated essentially by the Americans over a short strike campaign last year. So essentially all the proxy groups that Iran has funded and supported to do the dirty work for them have been taken out, including in those countries I just mentioned, as well as the militias in Iraq were no longer as effective because the government there was more structured and able to deal with that to an extent. And then essentially, lastly, what occurred was essentially that the Americans and in Israel specifically decided that the nuclear threat was too high, that they'd taken out all the sort of the tentacles of Iran, and they were going to chop the head off of the snake essentially. And so this is why you saw the bombing in June of last year. And then now they're essentially going in for the kill shot to degrade the regime. The specifics of it are sort of immaterial because, again, no one knows. No one has perfect information. But essentially, I would argue that the purpose of that invasion is essentially a 20 to 30 year run-up of conflict, consistent low-grade bubbling conflict between the Western countries and Iran specifically. And then because of Russian weakness, the Americans and the Israelis sense that Russia and its allies will not support Iran, which they have not in a meaningful way. And this allows them to do the kinetic option to degrade their government as it is right now. And you can see this across the board. Like, for example, in Venezuela, which is also strategically aligned with, let's say, Russia, China, the Americans went in and decapitated or kidnapped, I suppose, or took the leader out of the country on a crime, like a law enforcement action. But the reason they were able to do that without any sort of big repercussions, let's say, is because the Russians were just bogged down in Ukraine. And you can see them also moving that within Cuba as well. They've stopped the ability of Latin American countries to put oil into Cuba, which again is an ally of the sort of Russian-Chinese sort of strategic alignment, let's say. So essentially, you can frame this all back to the Russians bogged themselves down. All their materials and money and support goes into the Ukraine conflict. The Ukrainians can't win the war, but they're just hanging on long enough. And then the Americans have taken advantage of this, and the Western countries have taken advantage of this by essentially taking out one strategic ally at a time. And this is the key part. This is super important for, I think, the geopolitical security of the world. Again, this is just my humble opinion. I'm happy to be wrong on all these things and be educated. But generally speaking, I would say that the Chinese, Iranian, Russia sort of strategic alignment they've been wildly diminished. If the Iranians are taken out completely and a government that is, let's say, more neutral to the world comes in, this is a big thing for two elements. One, the Iranians, locals, will be able to generate a government that would suit them, as opposed to a government that kills them or represses them. So that's worth it just on that basis. But from a wider scope, and regional instability would decrease. But on a wider scope, this will essentially take one of the three pillars of that strategic alignment completely out. the Russians will be in a weaker position because Iran isn't there to destabilize the Middle East. And the Western countries, if there's more stability in the Middle East, can focus on other strategic threats as it is. And if you're the Chinese government, you're looking at this situation and saying, oh my gosh, it looks like the Russian and Chinese air defense systems don't work that well. Maybe our military capabilities are not as high as we think, and this will prohibit them or deter them from invading Taiwan, which would be a significant geopolitical event that would lead to, would be 10,000 times more detrimental to human flourishing than the current context in the Middle East. So regardless of whether you think the Americans are good or bad, or these Israelis are good or bad, or even the Iranians are good or bad, if Iran is taken out, this is beneficial to the Western geopolitical security framework. And the people that I talked to that are in that bubble, when they saw that Israel and America went to attack Iran and degrade their government or degrade their capacity for regional instability and pursuing the nuclear weapons, they perceive this as a very positive thing if you're from the perspective of a US, Canadian, Western, global liberal order point of view. The US has come back in as the global policeman and is enforcing the norms. Whether the norms and rules that they enforce are good, based on your opinion, is immaterial. It's just more like that seems to be what's happening. And that usually, when the US has the monopoly of the hegemony or the monopoly on violence or power, then the norms of that the US implements through the post-World War II context, the UN, the World Bank, World Trade Center, all these different World Trade Organization, all these different organs essentially have more legitimacy. So whether that's good or bad is up for you to decide, but I think that's the state of play as it is. But just make sure that if you're thinking of Iran as a country that would be similar to Canada or England or something like that, this is not the same. This is not the same country. It's not the same kind of regime. And if the regime were to fall, if nothing else, the Iranian people would at least have the chance to implement a government that works in their interest and doesn't repress them or kill them on the street. So that's it. I just want to give you that layout. Hope that was useful. That was a lot of information. This is just a very narrow slice of it. And again, in geopolitics, it's always if this happens, maybe, So it's a probabilistic articulation of the future and probabilistic framing of things. So again, apply your critical rationalism, assume that my opinion can change if new information comes around, and take this as one piece of information that you would use and lay on top as you collect more information when you're watching X or whatever the case. Oh, and the last thing too I would say too is that when I'm watching my news feed, I'll see stuff like, Americans bombed a school with girls, and then the next post will say, no, it's actually Iran shooting a rocket and they bombed themselves by accident, killing schoolgirls. So the information on the web or on the social media right now is just flying. It's a huge velocity of activity. I would say most of it's propaganda and very little bit is actually factually true. So saying something like the US and Israel attacked Iran, you could say that's probably pretty true. But then the nuanced details of that, one, I think it's unknowable until much farther down the line. So just keep that in mind as you're engaging with information on the internet, that not all of it's real. And most of it, even if it is real, is geared to push you in a certain direction, either for or against or whatever. So don't fall prey to that and don't let the emotions lead. Let logic be the guide in this context. Thank you very much. Take care.